Alright, class, we are on to our last perspective, our last review of deviance by looking at conflict theory. So just a quick reminder, conflict theory believes that all of society is built off of competing groups, people that are fighting for resources, fighting for position and status, fighting for power and control over society. And so these groups aren't in compromise, they're in conflict. And so in the realms of deviance, we would want to look at how these different groups, how your positions of power or lack of power might influence your rates of deviance, and what might that indicate about how equal versus unequal a society is based off of these conflicting agencies. So using all of the feedback you've received so far, today you're going to do your conflict worksheet. Today's assignment will be the last check-in before you submit your final project, the portfolio, next week. So open up your worksheets. You can fill that in as we go through and do the notes for today. All right, within conflict theory, the biggest thing that they would focus on is our criminal justice system. The criminal justice system is there to enforce the rules and laws of society. And so it would look at the police and arrest rates. It would look at the court system and our policies of charging criminal offenders. And then the prison system and who is in prison, how long is their duration, their stay there. Right. The law book that the criminal justice system follows and enforces is built on those norms of society. Right. If you violate a folkway, which would be like a minor law, well, we might enforce that by giving you a fine or maybe community service. But if you break a mores, if you break a taboo, well, that'll be enforced with stricter penalties. And so this might incur jail time that you have. This might be an isolation type thing. And so the more heavily valued the norm, the stricter those laws tend to be enforced. Right? The power elite are the ones that create the laws, and therefore they're the ones that control the criminal justice system. If we were going to talk about the social hierarchy, the power elite are the ones completely up at the top. If we were going to use Marxist ideas, that's our capitalist class, those business owners, the bourgeoisie. And so they make laws that help protect their position in society, and they make the rest of society follow the values and the norms that they think are important. If you were going to think about good counsel, right, well, who are the people that create the rule book, the handbook that you are supposed to follow? Well, we would have the board of good counsel made up of alumni and prestigious individuals within the education system. Maybe Mr. Campbell, Dr. Barker, Mr. Arnold and Miss Lopez, who are part of the disciplinary force. They would be helping and giving a lot of input in the rule books. And so our power elite, they decide what society should look like. And then because they have all the control, because they have this high status position, they get to make the rules to ensure everybody else follows that same thing and lives up to the ideals that the power elite thinks is important. What keeps them in power is the working class. Right, the working class follow the rules and the laws that are set up by the elite. And so these are usually the conformist individuals. The teachers at Good Counsel, we're the working class. We follow the rules in the handbook. We sometimes have to step in and enforce them. And so if I see a student out of dress code, a student cheating, well then I charge them with those laws that they broke and deal with it on that sense. Right? Our student body, a lot of you guys are the working class. You follow the rules and you listen to the power elite. Right? To keep the working class in line, to help preserve their position of power, the power elite will actually give dispensations to certain members of the working class. If I keep the working class happy, they'll keep me in power, and so it's almost a two-way street. For example, our seniors. We give you special privileges in the hopes of keeping you invested in the community and helping teach the underclassmen what they're supposed to do. So you get to bring your laptops to school where everybody else is restricted just to iPad use. You get dressed down, those special senior sweatshirts that you have, the exemption policies for your exams. If you get the 85 for the semester, 85 for the final quarter. All right, by giving out these special privileges, these lax restrictions on your behaviors, the working class is happy, and the working class will keep the power elite in control. All right, our marginalized are usually where we see most deviance. All right, our marginalized are the lowest members of our social structure, and they aren't the ones that are considered by the power elite when making the rules and the laws. Right? These are the ones where they would experience the most strain. Thinking about strain theory we talked about last class, right? They have the greater difficulties of achieving those cultural goals. The institutionalized means, the rules that they're supposed to follow weren't developed with them in mind, and so the means don't necessarily work for them easily. They're the ones that are most likely to be negatively labeled. So if we think back to labeling theory from our symbolic unit, right? And so because they have these negative statuses, these negative stigmatized position in societies, people don't think about them. And so when we have deviance, usually it's coming from our marginalized classes because they aren't considered. Not only that, our marginalized groups are also most likely to be the victims of deviance. Since they aren't thought about, since they aren't considered, crimes against them are usually unnoticed. So for example, if you look at your conflict chart, I chose a real person for this worksheet. It's Herman Mudgett or H.H. Holmes. And so he targeted single women that were coming through Chicago during the World's Fair, and he victimized them. He murdered them, and he was able to do this for so long because they were marginalized women. They were poor, they were alone, they had no family support, and people didn't think about them. People didn't value them. We've talked about this multiple times in class. Our poor freshmen that get made fun of a lot. Well, they're new to the system. They aren't there at the beginning, so we don't consider their needs when they come in. And so they're most likely to be victimized, bullied, made fun of, because they're the marginal group within our society. So I want you to think about your case study and identify the different groups that would be part of the social classes. All right, from the society that your case study is in. Who are the power elite? Who's making the rules, making the laws? All right, who are the working class members? People who help keep them in positions of power. People who go about their day-to-day lives but allow the laws to continue. And then who are our marginalized individuals? Who are the ones that are experiencing the most strain, the most stress, those that are most likely to be victimized? And so identify the social hierarchy that would be present in your case study. Whenever you're ready with that, move on to the next part of your worksheet and just hit go again on this lesson. All right, so we've got our social hierarchy down. Now, the next thing we need to look at in our criminal justice system is what are the laws that are broken? Since we have different groups competing for power, and since the power elite are only making the laws that are convenient for them, we know that the law is applied inconsistently. Our marginalized individuals are much more likely to be charged than our power elite members. We remember this from our symbolic interactionist unit. The case study looking at the Saints and the Roughnecks, the teenagers from the same town. They're breaking the same rules, so skipping classes, petty theft, drinking underage, driving recklessly. But the Roughnecks were the ones that were punished for the behavior. They were given detention, they were given tickets and fines, they were held accountable. But our Saints, well, because they're from the good families, the more prestigious, higher in the social order families, they were let off with a warning. They weren't charged. And so a conflict theorist would be really interested in the fact that our law that's supposed to preserve order isn't really applied consistently because it's built towards keeping our power elite in control. All right, so we've talked about street crime versus corporate white-collar crime. All right, street crime is face-to-face interactions versus white-collar crime, that's our people in positions of power committing crimes just for themselves. Well, the reason why white-collar crimes are less heavily enforced, the reason why the penalties aren't as severe, is because really there aren't any specialized agencies to oversee these things. There's no real enforcement procedures because some of these crimes are relatively new. All right, so for example, the BP oil spill. Right? The Gulf Coast, there's a lot of businesses that just never recovered from what happened. Tourism went down because people weren't going to come and swim on the beaches that were polluted. Fishing industries that were going out and getting fish from the ocean, well, they couldn't because the fish were dying or infected with the pollutants from the water. Right? Well, BP was supposed to pay out these, give out checks to people that were impacted by these choices. But there was no agency forcing them to do it. So out of all the people that were impacted, it was only a very few that actually received some compensation for what happened. And it's because we don't have any specialized agencies available to enforce these rules. Right? Maybe there are no laws written down, so technically they didn't do anything wrong. Right? If you talk to the victims, BP did a lot of things wrong. But if you look at the laws, technically nothing was violated, so there's no real accountability that we can enforce. Right? And since we know our white-collar crimes or corporate crimes are committed by those in the prestigious positions, they're part of the power elite, well, I don't want any laws passed that say that what I'm doing is wrong. And so it's almost like a perpetual system where these crimes are more detrimental, but they're less heavily enforced than our street crimes. A street crime would be theft. And so if I mug you and I get all the money out of your pockets, I don't know, maybe I'm walking away with $100. All right, but if I'm guilty of embezzlement, where I have you invest in my Ponzi scheme, well, you could lose all of your money. That's what happened with the Enron scandal, where people invested in this business that they knew was going under. And because they weren't open and honest with their investors, people lost thousands of dollars, sometimes millions of dollars, because of these fraudulent reports that they were getting. Right. Now, sometimes to keep the lower classes in line, we're going to release a scandal. All right. A power elite member is going to be sacrificed because they did something that was really, really deviant. They're not the only one who's guilty of this crime, but it's the only one we're holding accountable. And because we can point to this one case study, this one deviant individual that's held accountable for their actions, it kind of makes the working class calm down and keeps our power elite safe and intact. So think of some scandals that you might know of. Well, there's the Watergate scandal where Nixon's campaign community, they snuck into the other campaigns and stole secrets. Right? Is he the first political candidate who spied on his opponent? Probably not. But what he did was really extreme, and those hidden tapes and the lying that took place. Again, probably not the first political official to lie under oath, but it was a big story. And so by prosecuting this one case, other power elite members doing the same behaviors, just to a lesser extent, can continue with their deviant actions. Another presidential scandal, the Monica Lewinsky scandal with Bill Clinton. All right, Clinton probably isn't the first president who's had an affair in office. He's probably not the first husband who's had an affair. Right? But it was a big story because he had such a high position in society, and these details were coming out, and all the secrets and the lies that were trying to protect it. Right? So we have these scandals. The most current scandal with the celebrities that were buying their children's way into prestigious institutions, paying people to take the SATs for their kids so that we get the perfect score. Right? They're probably not the first parents who have done that. There's a lot of individuals who maybe bribed their way into colleges. But because we recognize these actors, these actresses, it's a big scandal. And so we hold these few power elite accountable as a way of keeping everybody else either distracted by the story or appease that somebody is being charged and the rest of the power elite get away with doing the exact same thing. All right? If we want to change the laws, if we want to change who gets penalized and what those penalties are, well, we need members of the working class and the marginalized groups to achieve the same status of the power elite. We need the power to change hands. This is why elections are so important. We're putting new people in office in the hopes of them creating laws and passing bills that would better impact our community, our category, our society, and what we think would be helpful for us. So for example, hate crimes. Those are relatively new laws that are within our criminal justice system. right? Before it might be intimidation or vandalism, minor petty crimes, right? But now, if you're writing slurs on a religious building, if you're burning crosses in someone's yard, that's a hate crime. And the only way that those laws were passed was because marginalized groups, people in the working class that were being targeted by these specific actions, achieved the level of power elite where they were able to pass laws that protected people from their categories. And so the laws are flexible and they're changeable, but it's contingent upon who do we put in power so that they can create these laws. All right, so go back to your worksheet, go back and review the work that you've been doing, and identify the different types of crimes and how they're regulated within your case study. What are some laws that maybe your political activist groups are trying to create and change because they want to be in a power position? What are some laws that maybe your serial killers, your robbers broke, your gangs that they violated? And how were they treated within the criminal justice system? How were they enforced and monitored and regulated? All right, and then once you filled in that part of your chart, you can pick up with the rest of the lecture and get the last section done. All right, the last thing conflict theorists would look at is our criminal justice system and how it actually enforces the laws. So we need to look at our prison systems and who is there and what are the penalties for people who've been charged with those crimes. All right, first, we have to address the fact that all of our statistics are wrong. All right, police discretion states that the police, the enforcers of the laws, they decide who gets charged and who gets let off with a warning. For example, the teachers, where the police in the hallways trying to make sure students are following the law book of the student handbook. All right, so if I see a student in the hallway talking on their phone, all right, you're allowed to have your phone, but it's supposed to be off. So what do I do with that student? All right, 1, I could ignore it and just keep going about my day. 2, I could tell them to stop and put their phone away, but let them keep it. 3, I could take their phone and have them come to me at the end of the day. Or 4, I can send them to Mr. Arnold, Miss Lopez, and have them face the full penalty of their crime. Right? The police do the same thing. If I get pulled over for speeding, I could get arrested for violating the law, depending on how fast I'm going, or how many tickets I already have on my record. They could give me another ticket, or they could just give me a warning and let me go off about my day, or not even pull me over. Right, so if we're looking at the criminal justice system and how it's enforced, we have to recognize that our crime statistics are going to be flawed because not all criminal offenders are actually charged and therefore they aren't documented within our system. And so it's going to skew a lot of the information that we get. All right, since we know that the police represent the power elite, they are usually members of the working class, but they are there to keep the elite in power, which means they believe in the values and the norms that the power elite created. They're going to listen to what they stated, and therefore, if the power elite make laws against bad people, the police are going to see those exact same individuals as bad. Usually those bad people, they come from our marginalized groups, and so if we look at those that are charged, those that are arrested, those that are in the criminal justice system, well, usually because of police discretion, it's those bad people, those that are stereotyped and stigmatized within our society. Those are the ones that are much more likely to be arrested because they match up with our stereotype of, oh, you're a bad person. So for example, if I was going to go walk around a store and go shopping, well, because I'm older individual compared to you as a teenager, well, teenagers, they steal things all the time. There's that stereotype against your age group. And so I would have a little bit more liberty walking around and maybe stealing things because I'm not being observed. But you, because you fit that stereotype of teenagers steal, you'd be much more likely to be monitored and therefore much more likely to be caught when you break those laws. And so this police discretion thing, because they uphold the power elite, it does reflect some of our inherent biases and some stereotypes that are present within the system. So let's take a look at some crime statistics. All of the graphs and charts that you see on the right side of the page, they're taken from your textbook. So if you can't see them in this video, if you can't see them on the slides, you can follow along in your textbook pages as well. In the United States, we have a very large prison population. Statistics as of 2010 said that 1 out of 143 citizens are in jail. The United States has more prisons than any other nation. All right, so maybe that's a sign that we are good about capturing and enforcing the laws, and so we accurately monitor and control our deviant offenders. Or we're over-regulating the system and there are more people in prison than maybe are necessarily guilty of crimes. And so if you look at these statistics, if our criminal justice system is perfect, the percentage of prisoners, which you see in the middle column there, and the percentage of the U.S. population in general, which you see on the far right, the darker column, those two numbers should be identical. Right? But what we see is that there's some inconsistencies. There are certain groups that are more likely to be represented in prison that don't reflect their actual proportion of the general U.S. population. So take a moment and look at these number discrepancies and what are some stereotypes about that group that might make them appear to be more or less deviant than others. Right, so if we're going to talk about age, the biggest age on the general U.S. population is people 55 and older, but they only make up 1% of our prison population versus our 25 to 34-year-olds. Well, that's 35% of the population. If you look at race, right, whites make up the majority of the U.S. population at 68%. Right, but if you look over in their population of the prison system, they're 35% compared to the 46% African American and only 12% of the U.S. population. Right. The sex one, that's a very big difference. It's 50-50 split for men and women, but if you look at them in the prison population, almost 90% are men. Right? Single people are much more likely to be in prison, but out in the general population, about 60% are likely to be married. All right? Less than a high school or a high school graduate, both of those make up the majority, almost 90% of everyone in the prison population. But if you look at the general U.S. population, there really isn't that much of them out there. And so what this shows is that maybe there are some stereotypes. All right, maybe the reason why there's such a huge difference between the male-female population. All right, we talked about this in our gender unit. There are stereotypes about men that they're more disruptive, more violent, more aggressive. And so maybe that's true. And so those prison populations accurately reflect what men are like. Or men are more likely to be monitored and then charged when they break the crime. But the women, because they don't match the stereotype of being dangerous, aren't charged. Or when they're charged, they aren't sent to prison. They're given other penalties. Right? So we have these differences. Taking a look at our age group. Right? Maybe the 55%, the 55 and older that make up our 1% in prison and our 22% of the general population. Right? They don't really match our stereotype of what is bad, what's dangerous. All right? Maybe they have positions of power. And so 55, you probably found a good job by that point. And so you don't feel the strain that our younger age groups might feel. So we have these differences that are there. And so we can see some of the inherent biases or maybe some of the strain that we're putting on the marginalized individuals by looking at who makes up our prison population. Right, another thing that a criminal conflict theorist would be interested in is our recidivism rate. You've served time in prison before, you've paid back your dues to society, you've been rehabilitated, so in theory you should be released and then never come back. Well, what we find is that there are a lot of criminal offenders who are repeat offenders. You break the rules over and over again. All right, and so our crime statistics are also slightly skewed because we might be counting people more than once within certain categories. So if we track our recidivism rates, it helps remove that bias from the system. Right? If you look at this chart, this bar graph that you see over here, it looks at the original crime that somebody was charged with and served time in prison, and then looked at the odds of them committing the same crime again. Right? So stealing cars. 79% of our people who were originally charged with stealing cars committed that exact same crime again and were rearrested, right? Versus murder, only 41% of people who have committed that crime before were rearrested for the similar crime. I don't know how someone who's murdered is getting released and then committing another murder, but there's that. All right, with our recidivism, stealing cars is going to serve less of a penalty as maybe our murder, and so our murderer is less likely to get out, or when they get out, they're very old and don't have the time to commit another murder, versus stealing cars, I don't even know, maybe like 3 years in prison. And so maybe you have time to consistently do that. The penalty isn't as bad. The stigma around committing that crime isn't as heavy. And so our recidivism rates also indicates what are some of those mores, right? The likelihood of those crimes being recommitted. Right. The heaviest penalty that we use in our criminal justice system is capital punishment. Right? This is the death penalty. You are murdered for your actions. Right. We try to base the punishments based on the severity of the crime. And so if you have a very bad crime, we're going to have you serve longer periods of time in prison. And so the death penalty is reserved only for those worse offenses. Usually murder tends to be the only one that is, justified for capital punishment. So if you look, this is a map of the United States. The statistics are about 10 years out of date, 15 years out of date. But it shows the states that have the death penalty and how many times they've actually executed anyone. You see Maryland over there with 3. Maryland recently repealed using the capital punishment, I think 2 years ago. But Virginia, our neighbor to the south, that's 89. So for example, there was a big debate over the DC snipers. Where are we going to charge them with their crimes? In Maryland, in Virginia, right? And so they ultimately were charged within Virginia because that scandal over the sniper shootings, we wanted them to receive the stiffest penalty. And the odds of them getting the death penalty was a lot higher in Virginia versus if they were charged in Maryland. And so these states, they have these laws that are even different just across the border. And so that's another problem. Looking at the original slide, looking at the inconsistencies of the people serving time in prison. All right, part of the reason why Maryland repealed its use of the death penalty is because we know only certain offenders were getting longer periods in prison. And so because of that inconsistency, that bias, they thought it would be unfair to take somebody's life versus another person committing the similar crime of a different racial background, a different age group, a different gender, might get a different penalty. So they've removed it for that justification. But you can see that there are a lot of states that don't have the death penalty, states that have the death penalty but have never used it, states that use it a lot, states that don't use it at all. So like Idaho, Wyoming, they have it, but they've only used it once. Tennessee also won. Texas, it's a large state, so maybe that's what's happening. But they've got 313. All right, so we have these differences in our systems. All right, so one final time, I want you to go back and look at the laws that are enforced within your case study. What are some elements of police discretion where they were excused from crimes or held accountable for their crimes? The law enforcements that take place within them. And so go through and see if you can look at any moments of the actual prison structures and how they're present within your case. All right, once you're done with your work, you can submit it, and I'll get you feedback over the weekend before we get our final submissions next week. All right, thank you so much, guys.